Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister, That Blood Thrill. By Kurt Matthewy. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Dead. I made a curious discovery last night, Raffles said to his friend Charlie Brand, with whom he was in his study. At 1 hour after midnight I passed through Lincoln Street and saw two men getting out of a rental car and dragging with them an apparently fainted lady. Since the gentlemen were in the evening toilet and in a very merry mood, I suspected that the lady was too drank a lot of champagne. They stopped in front of the jeweler Morton's house, and one of the gentlemen took a house key from his pocket and opened the door next to the warehouse. I know that house, and know that only the old jeweler Morton with a housekeeper and servant lives there. I once saw the owner on a visit to the shop. I take him for someone well into their 60s. Old Morton has a patriarchal appearance. All this occurred to me when I looked at the house from across the street. I was about to go on when a brilliant light, falling out of the warehouse, stopped me. At first I thought it was the night watchman, but later I clearly discerned that the lady whom I had thought to be unconscious or intoxicated was standing inside and holding a real thief's lantern, such as those used in Whitechapel, whose system is very antiquated. The closed cabinets was busy. This interested me. A female colleague in the field of jewelry theft, that was something new for me. I carefully crossed the quiet street, and, looking through the barred shop window, saw that the lady was packing jewels in a leather bag, but suddenly stopped her work, because a suppressed cry, like a man who utters when he terror, resounded from within the house. A moment later that cry was silenced. But already my female colleague had covered her lantern, and I had to move away from the window, lest she discover my shadow. What could have happened in that house? A murder? Had the lady's comrades murdered the old jeweler while she was working in the shop? My thinking was interrupted by a bright light, which again fell through the shop window onto the street. Careless, I thought. They must be newcomers to the business. How dare they light up the shop at night, so that the first policeman or night watchman who passes by can see everything? I was just about to stand at the window like an ordinary passerby to look inside, when a police officer approached with slow, heavy strides. I immediately ran to meet him, but when I had passed him I stopped to light a cigarette with great fuss. I did this so that I could check him out without drawing his attention. I expected every moment that he would pull out his whistle and call for help. Furthermore, I saw the agent in the brightly lit shop look in, and to my great astonishment afterwards noticed that he saluted inside and went on. Now I went back myself and threw away my cigarette to light a new one in front of the shop window. I could see everything at ease now. In the illuminated shop I saw the lady sitting in a chair, looking closely at a piece of jewelry. Before her stood one of her companions in a frock coat, and next to him stood the old jeweler. The jeweler appeared to be giving the lady a description of the piece of jewelry and confirmed his words with bustling hand gestures. I went on, trying to clear up this mysterious matter. The lady with the thief's lantern whom I had first seen, and the cry I had heard, made me doubt the authenticity of the scene I just beheld. Thoughtfully, John Raffles scanned the puffs of smoke from his cigarette, while Charlie Brand replied, "You must have been mistaken, Edward. Who knows what you have mistaken for a thief's lantern? My dear Charlie, you know that in my museum I have a collection of all possible instruments of my colleagues. I have a lantern exactly like the one the lady used. And the very fact that she used a thief's lantern, such as the modern craftsmen no longer use, proves to me that I had before me either a novice or a creature from Whitechapel or East End. "That thief's lantern will become Mr. Morton," replied Charlie Brand. "Nonsense," laughed John Raffles. "For what purpose would he have such a thing, when he has electric light in his shop?" "It is true," thought Charlie thoughtfully, "but you said yourself that Mr. Morton has a housekeeper and a servant. If a crime was committed on Mr. Morton, it should have been discovered this morning. But the papers don't talk about it." "You are right," said Raffles, lighting a new cigarette, "but I am convinced that I am faced with a secret here, and I will work to discover it today. I have discovered that Mr. Morton, which I didn't know, had rare pearls in his shop. And I have always had a special passion for pearls. I can safely say that I have already had in my hands the most beautiful specimens that exist in the world. So I'll probably go and see Mr. Morton's jewels tonight." Charlie Brand laughed and Lord Lister looked at him in surprise. "I laugh," said Charlie, "at your expression, at Mr. Morton to want to look at it. I did not know that it was your custom to look at valuables without appropriating them." "That goes without saying," said John Raffles, looking at his watch. "That's my sport." He seemed to be contemplating a plan as he looked at the dial. After a few moments he rose, put his watch with him, and took up his fur coat. "Are you going out?" asked Charlie Brand. "Yes," replied his friend, "I intend to make a purchase from Mr. Morton, and if you wish you may come with me." Charlie got up and got dressed too. The two then left the house. A rental car took him to Mr. Morton's business on Lincoln Street. They left the carriage waiting at the door and entered the shop. A young man, whom Raffles had not seen on his earlier visit to the shop, stood behind the counter to speak to them. John Raffles greeted him from on high and asked, "Is Mr. to speak to Morton?" "It pains me," replied the questioner, "Mr. Morton is away for a few days and I represent him." "That surprises me," replied Raffles. "I have an important appointment with this gentleman, for I wanted to buy a precious pearl jewelry from him." The great unknown remarked that an expression of embarrassment appeared on the young man's face. After some hesitation, however, he replied, "Certainly, sir, it will come true. I remember that Mr. Morton informed me of your visit and ordered me to show you several strings of pearls." Raffles' eyes sparkled at these words, and took on a cold, sharp expression. He had his prey in his power. He had neither made an appointment with the jeweler nor discussed the purchase of pearls. "But can I see the jewelry?" he asked. "I am sorry," replied the young man, "I sent them this morning to a lady who also intends to buy them." "Your way of doing business really amazes me," said Raffles sharply. "I already paid half the price to Mr. Morton and received a receipt from him for it, so that he has no right to sell the pieces in any way." "Excuse me," apologized the young man, who, Raffles saw, was trying to hide his embarrassment. "Mr. Morton seems to have forgotten. He had to travel in a hurry." "When can I get the pearls?" asked Raffles. "I'll have them back in a few hours," was the reply. "It's all right," nodded the great stranger, "if I have time, I'll come back again tonight. Otherwise I will come tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, because I want to give the pearls as a present tomorrow." With a short greeting he left the shop with Charlie Brand. As they sat in the carriage, Raffles said, "The mice are trapped. So I was not mistaken. There, in spite of our world-famous London police, a gigantic crime has been committed. I bet £1 against a plum kernel." "You should have become a detective," laughed his secretary, "because you have the greatest skills for that profession." Raffles replied with a smile, "My dear Charlie, to be able to practice the sport of burglary well, one must first of all be a born detective. But the profession of detective is too useless to mankind. For have you ever heard that the lords of the London police ever put the robbed or defrauded back into possession of their property? And I argue that a good detective should do this. The arrest of a criminal does only half a service to the robbed and a disadvantage to the rest of society." "A disadvantage?" asked Charlie. "Certainly," came the reply, "for that man is being maintained in prison, at the expense of the others." At these words, the carriage stopped in front of Lord Lister's house in Regent Park. "If you want to pay a visit to the jeweler's shop tonight, we shouldn't tarry long," said Charlie. "I'm not going there tonight," replied Lord Lister, "but I will, as is my custom, make my visit at night. The pearls will certainly be there, and that is the main purpose of my visit. I'm going not like in vain." After those words he sank into deep thought and Charlie did not dare to disturb him. He knew that such silence with Raffles was always the beginning of a great plan. Near the Strand, Raffles stopped the carriage and both dismounted. Raffles liked to take a stroll in the evening along the wonderful quays of the Thames. He often took pieces of bread and scraps of meat from his dinner with him to feed the gulls flying over the water. He took pleasure in these elegant seabirds. Today, too, he took out a packet of bread crusts from his overcoat and began to feed the animals. Like a white, whirling cloud of snow, the birds surrounded him, and some of them were so brave that they snatched the pieces of bread from his hand. Passers-by stopped to watch the scenic scene. Even a police officer stood next to Raffles and smiled. Charlie thought with a mocking look on his face. If that man only knew who this animal lover is, happiness is so near and yet so far. Suddenly there were the shrill voices of newspaper boys. Everyone turned to them. What had happened again? Raffles too hastily threw his last morsels of bread before the birds and listened to the shouts of the boys. Petrosino, the terror of the mafia, murdered in Palermo. Immediately Raffles went to the nearest boy to buy a leaf. With a gloomy look on his face he flew through the sensational article by the light of a gas lantern and then handed it to Charlie Brand. He read the following with interest. An American detective murdered. The revenge of the mafia. On wire message. Rome, March 13. Petrosino, the famous New York detective, the terror of the secret alliance of the Manovera, was shot this night at Palermo. Petrosino, Sicilian by birth, had returned to his native country for reasons unknown so far. The Black Hand had long doomed him. The police found in the wallet of the murdered many documents relating to the secret society and letters from the Italian Minister of Justice Lenardi. The perpetrators are not known. They are probably members of the mafia, who strictly obeyed the orders of their American brothers. Charlie Brand put down the newspaper and said, "A creepy association." "The paper is wrong," replied Raffles. "The Black Hand Chief Committee is not in New York, but in London." "How do you know that? Have you been in contact with that dangerous gang yet?" "I know from Petrosino himself." Charlie Brand looked at his friend with interest. "Do you know Petrosino?" "Yes, my dear Charlie. In New York he was called the Italian Sherlock Holmes. He was the terror of all the Italian criminals who had fled to America. He knew that they had sworn death on him 1,000 times, but he always claimed, 'I do my duty, and if God wills it, I will die.'" "That's very interesting, what you tell me there. Perhaps you will tell me more about your meeting with that Italian Sherlock Holmes Petrosino." It was extremely rare for Raffles to tell of his past. For him, everything that had happened was over for good. "It's strange. While I was feeding the seagulls I thought of Petrosino, and as if the dead man wanted to give me another sign, I read the newspaper at the same moment." "You were apparently very close friends with him." Raffles's face had an expression of genuine sadness. "I was very close to him for a while, and he was a wonderful man. Someone who thought and acted ideally. He only accepted the dangerous profession out of idealism. No nation of the world, not even China, has such a devilish criminal class as Italy. Compared to them the English and German crooks are good fellows. Those Italians, however, are reminiscent of the times of Nero. No devil could conceive of more heinous crimes than these Italian mafias, the members of the Black Hand. They are worse than dangerous, my boy. Your brains wouldn't be able to devise infamy the way these ruffians do them." "How did you get to know Petrosino?" 5 years ago in New York, when I found myself there on my world tour, just returning from Japan, and accompanied by a companion, an Austrian young and lively officer, one Baron von Roden. I was then Lord Edward Lister and suspected nothing of my present existence as John C. Raffles. In those days I got to know Petrosino." He was silent and hastily pulled on his cigarette, like someone who wants to blow away unpleasant memories. And without Charlie having to ask him more, Raffles went on. "We both, the Baron and I, were in New York for the first time. Without a guide, only with a map of the city, we passed through the giant city and one day arrived in the Italian Quarter. We had no idea how dangerous it was there. The strange, colorful bustle in those streets interested us. Processions were held in honor of some saint. The streets were decorated with flags and garlands, altars, statues of saints and hundreds of burning wax candles were set up everywhere. This was not ordinary New York, but Naples in New York. The American people are well suited to their new fellow citizens, and so the Italians have completely converted a large area of New York into an Italian colony. Petrosino estimated the number of inhabitants of this colony at 3 times 100,000 souls. That is the same as the population of one of the largest Italian cities. Yes, and you may safely say, the greatest Italian criminal colony. It is an absolute impossibility for American detectives and police officers to do their duty there. That is why the American government appointed Italian special detectives, of which Petrosino took charge. Will you tell me how you met him? I'm burning with curiosity. I got to know him through a terrible event. I already called you the name of Baron von Roden. Charlie nodded in agreement. He had the folly of falling in love with a black-eyed Sicilian on one of our trips through the Italian quarter. She was apparently the daughter of a castellan. We had entered the winery to order a real Italian dinner, and the girl served us. Immediately I noticed that she was flirting strongly with the Baron, and that he was returning her glances. The Italian wine made his blood flow faster. Heeding my warning, he meddled with her and, when we left, gave a $1 bill as a tip, which she accepted with a seductive smile. From that moment the Baron began to find my company a nuisance. He laughed at my warnings, and as I was neither his guardian nor a relative of his, I cared no more about him. Raffles was silent and lit another cigarette. The match he used trembled in his hand. Charlie Brand noticed from this that his friend was thinking of something terrible. Already he feared that Raffles would tell no more when he went on. I hadn't seen the Baron in 3 days, when the manager of the hotel came into my room and asked me in great dismay whether I did not know where the Baron was. He had not been to the hotel for 2 days, all his belongings lay untouched, important letters had arrived for him, the consul had asked for him several times, and so on. I couldn't answer, but a nervous uneasiness overcame me. What had happened to the Baron? Immediately I remembered the meeting in the inn between the Baron and the Sicilian. Could the Baron be found there? I decided to do research at once. In a few hours I was at the inn, which is on 2nd Avenue in New York. When I entered the room, it was filled with half a dozen Italians, chattering loudly. When I entered they were silent and cast suspicious glances at me. Each of these guys had a criminal face. Paragons of villainy. I pretended they were completely indifferent to me and ordered a bottle of Chianti, an Italian folk wine, from the innkeeper. Bring them unopened, I ordered, as a sudden distrust made me think of all kinds of anesthetics. When the innkeeper put the bottle on my table, I asked about his beautiful daughter. Mariette is out, he replied with an indifferent countenance. Sir has to come back in a week. I drank a few glasses of wine, paid and went back to my hotel. I had calmed down. The sudden departure of the Italian and the disappearance of the Baron must have been related. But the next day I was startled from my rest by the afternoon papers. I was walking along the Broadway making some purchases for my impending departure, when the paper boys yelled something that made everyone stop. Horrible was the tidings. The dismembered corpse in the barrel on the Broadway. I bought a newspaper and read. This morning about 8 o'clock some street cleaners made a terrible discovery on the corner of Broadway and 22nd Street. A wine barrel, which stood close to the sidewalk, and which was casually passed by thousands, aroused the attention of the 2 workers, and one of them lifted a sack covering the barrel. In the next instant he retreated with a cry of horror. A severed head stared out of the vessel with glass eyes. Soon thousands had gathered around the dreadful find. Police Chief Drummond rushed his detectives to the scene of the crime and examined the hideous contents of the barrel. The dismembered body of a stripped man was found. No detail betrays the mysterious origin of the murdered man. Who can he be? I stood for seconds thinking and stared at the number of the newspaper. That's Baron Roden, cried an inward voice. I shivered and tried in vain to push this thought away from me. An hour later, the newspapers ran another report. Petrosino at work. The Black Hand killed the man in the barrel. The article read: Petrosino, the chief of our Italian secret police, investigated the murder and found that the cask is a wine cask, such as the Italians get from Sicily. The way in which the unfortunate man was murdered also definitely points to Italians. They cut his throat with a razor. Apparently this is again dealing with a victim of the Black Hand. Petrosino calls upon anyone who is missing to inspect the murdered man. The unfortunate man is about 30 years old, has blonde military-style cropped hair, a small blonde mustache, grey-blue eyes, height 1.69 meter, well-groomed hands, which indicate that he belongs to the better class. The slain rings must have worn on the little finger and forefinger of the right hand. My hair stood on end when I read this. I don't know how I got into a carriage and into the morgue of police headquarters. Few minutes could have passed since I had read the newspaper when I saw through the window of the morgue the glazed eyes of Baron von Roden, which seemed to be staring at me with horror. With a cry I staggered back. I was so upset that I sought a support, and it was given to me by a serious person of dignified appearance, Petrosino. He supported me, led me out of the room into his office and said, "Did you recognize the dead one?" "Yes," I replied, "it is my traveling companion, an Austrian officer, Baron von Roden." "Are you not mistaken?" "No. He has been missing from the hotel for 4 days. Are you in a position to give me information as to whether your friend among the Italians living here had acquaintances or rather, enemies?" "In fact, every Austrian is an enemy of the Italians. It could be a political assassination." "I doubt that, Mr. Petrosino." "Why?" I now told of our wandering through the Italian quarter. Petrosino listened with keen attention. He could hardly wait for the conclusion of my short story. He trembled with impatience to follow the trail. "Could you join me at once?" I nodded in agreement. Petrosino turned to one of his officers. "Send a carriage at once." In a few seconds we were in the carriage and sped along the 2nd Avenue to the inn I designated. At some distance Petrosino stopped the carriage. "Have you any weapons with you?" he asked before we entered the inn. I showed him my revolver. "All right." Then we went inside together. We clearly noticed that the innkeeper looked up in amazement when we faced him. There were only 2 guests. I recognized in them 2 of the fellows from the previous day. One was apparently of enormous physical strength. "Hello, Signore Tony Oliva," cried Petrosimo to the innkeeper, reaching out his hand. "Much honor, Signore Petrosino," replied the innkeeper, turning his wrinkled face into a friendly grin. "What gives me the pleasure to see you with me?" Petrosimo had a peculiar habit of never using a mask or disguise. He loved going straight for his target. He never used cunning, but liked to attack boldly. "Come here, Signore Oliva, I must speak to you without the buffet separating us." An evil expression appeared in the innkeeper's eyes. He emerged hesitantly from behind the counter. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "A small thing. Take a good look at this gentleman." "Do you know him?" The innkeeper shrugged. "No, signore." "No? No." In the next instant came a savage cry, then the tinkling of iron. Petrosino had handcuffed the innkeeper with great dexterity. "Miserable!" cursed the handcuffed man, and turned to the 2 Italians present, who were preparing to come to the innkeeper's aid. Petrosino had produced a revolver. He knew the boys. "Sit down," he ordered, "no step forward. I hope you know Petrosino." "Dog catcher," murmured the Hercules with a look of hatred. Petrosino ignored the exclamation and turned again to the bound man. "Where is the girl who served here until recently?" "Outwards." "Where?" "Accursed. Ask someone else out. What is it to you where Marietto is?" "Beautiful." Petrosino opened the street door and whistled. A dozen of Petrosino's most feared men appeared like mushrooms from all sides. They had followed him unnoticed. "Would you like to tell me where Marietto is?" cried Petrosino to the innkeeper. "A half-mothered no," was the answer. In the next instant Petrosino applied the infamous 3rd degree feared by all criminals. A blow, followed by half a dozen others at lightning speed, struck the innkeeper's face and made him cry aloud in anger and pain. A pause followed. Petrosino waited for an answer. Again he raised his hand, but now the innkeeper cringed and exclaimed, "Don't hit. Mercy. She's here at home. But by all saints, signore, I swear to you, we have nothing to do with the vanished German." Petrosino looked at him coldly and sharply. "Who accuses you of having anything to do with the vanished German?" The innkeeper stood in front of him trembling. His knees seemed to be unable to bear him any longer. He saw that he had committed a stupidity. Answer: Oliver. It was in the papers. I have only now recognized that gentleman who is with you. The German who was with him in the inn. How do you know he's the missing one? Did you know his name? The innkeeper trembled again. He was no match for Petrosino. Suddenly he fell to his knees and begged for mercy. Petrosino measured him with a disdainful look. You can go with impunity if you tell who committed the crime. The innkeeper named a multitude of names. Suddenly there was a horrible howl. The Hercules had leapt to the kneeling innkeeper, grabbed him by the hair from behind, bent his head back, and cut his neck with a razor with enormous force. All this had gone faster than the time it takes to breathe. Then a shot rang out. The Hercules raised his arms, let out a half-choked cry and fell, face down, over the corpse of his victim. Indifferently, Petrosino put his revolver with him again. It was he who had shot. Then he stooped and turned up the shirt sleeves of the right arms of the two dead. All the detectives watched with interest. A small tattoo was visible on the arms. A black hand. The Mafia, said Petrosino. I thought so at once. Now we will catch the black decoy, and then those whose names I have learned from Oliver. He searched the house with some detectives. However, nothing was found. Marietta, who had doubtless played the unfortunate Baron into the hands of the Mafia, had fled. But weighty evidence of the innkeeper's complicity was found in the cellar of the inn. A room in the basement was, like a butcher's workshop, stained all over with blood. Here the unfortunate must have been eliminated. The clothes of the murdered man were also found in a chest, and in the cellar were a number of empty wine barrels, which looked exactly like the barrel in which the mutilated corpse had been found. Now Petrosino began a real hunt for the innkeeper's accomplices. He brought 18 Mafiaten under lock and key, but Marietta could not be found. The motive for the murder of the Baron was also established. He had $5,000 on him on the day of his death. Raffles, who had told all this in a slow tone, rubbed his forehead with his hand and took off his hat to cool his heated head. It was the longest story Raffles had ever done. He looked at his watch. It was 7 o'clock. We are going to supper, my boy, and then to work. Suddenly he stopped in the middle of the street and whistled softly. Charlie Brander looked at him in surprise. What is it? A deep sigh escaped Raffles' chest. Now I know why I thought of Petrosino and the mutilated corpse in the barrel and the black decoy Marietta. Damn it, Charlie, fate can be fickle. I've finally discovered the black Marietta. She's the lady with the thief's lantern. Really? I bet a fortune on it. So are we dealing with Mafia here? Certainly, my boy. That will be an interesting piece of work. Perhaps I can do the hapless Petrosino a favor in his grave and hand the Mafiat, the black Marietta, to the judge at last. Chapter 2. A Thief in the Night. No one would have recognized the dreaded gentleman burglar John C. Raffles and his friend Charlie Brand among the two men dressed as laborers who, by 2 o'clock in the morning, with their hands in their trouser pockets, numbed through the rows of houses. They crept past Morton's jeweler's shop, which was brightly lit for protection against thieves. The great stranger paused for a few seconds to light the short pipe of tobacco he had in his mouth. As a policeman passed by at this moment, John Raffles muttered an Irish curse, spat several times in front of him, and then went on. He stopped again 10 houses past Morton's business. It was in front of an old building in Old English style. It was only 3 windows wide, and there was a paper shop in the basement. After Raffles had looked to the right and left several times, he produced a looper with which he opened the front door. He hastily pushed Charlie Brand into the dark room, then entered himself and closed the door again. For a moment he paused, listening, as the steps of a passerby became audible. It was not until these were heard from again that he turned and took from his pocket an exquisitely crafted electric lantern, whose white light illuminated the walls of the narrow corridor, in which bales of paper and boxes were piled up to the ceiling. Charlie Brand looked anxiously about, but the great stranger, who noticed this, said, "Don't worry, cases of this kind don't have night watchmen. There is rarely anything here that would be worth taking. Now follow me to the higher floors." They now climbed up to the attic. Here the great stranger opened a wooden door with a looper, and immediately afterward they found themselves under the slanting, pointed roof of the house. "You'll have to climb a little, old boy," Raffles whispered, opening a skylight, Take off your shoes lest you slip. Here in the street they are all old houses with pointed gables, and one cannot walk over them as easily as over flat roofs. Be careful." He himself also took off his shoes and then clambered through the window on the roof. A moment later they were crawling on all fours. The houses were almost all of the same height. When they had gone about halfway, Raffles sat astride for a moment's rest, and invited his friend to do the same. "This walk on the roof reminds me of an ascent of Mont Blanc," whispered the great stranger. "I had to crawl along a frozen road for 2 hours with my guide. On either side of the pointed roof, which snow and ice had formed over a chasm, was an abyss 1,000 meters deep. It was an excellent exercise and I often think back to that climb with great pleasure." "I don't like such daredevils," murmured Charlie Brand. "I cannot say that the seat on this roof is so very pleasant to me, and I believe that if we fall 4 stories down here, we will achieve the same result as if we were a few thousand meters from Mont Blanc to deposit. I will be glad when I have solid ground under my feet again." "We'll be there soon," his friend comforted him, and they went on in silence. When they reached the 10th roof, John Raffles lifted a small skylight and climbed in, holding on to Charlie Brand. When he was half sitting in the window, he called to his friend to let go of the peak of the roof and hold his hand. One had to slide down the steep roof for a few yards to reach the window. With a careless movement, Charlie let go of his friend's hand as he slid down, and before the latter could grab him again, Charlie Brand slid along the slippery roof past the window. For a moment Raffles caught his breath, expecting every second to hear the dull crash of a body on the stones. The seconds seemed like hours to him. His thoughts were working feverishly. How could he help his friend? There he heard his name being called softly in the dark. A jolt of joy trembled him. Charlie must have found a foothold. "Where are you?" Raffles asked softly. "I'm hanging from a chimney," it sounded back. "Please come and help me." "At once," replied Raffles, and, whether or not he was seen, shone the light of his electric flashlight across the roof. Charlie Brand had slid down about 40 feet to the gutter, and they had found a fulcrum on one of the iron bars that supported a chimney. He hung on this. Only half of his body was visible, the other half hanging over the narrow gutter. "I'm coming." "Hold on," shouted Raffles. The great stranger unbuttoned his blouse and unwound a leather belt from his body, which had been wound around it several times, a belt such as the American cowboys use it. He tied one end to an iron hook of the window, the other he tied around his waist. Then he slid down. With great effort he leaned over to Charlie Brand and withdrew him to the roof. Then he unfastened the leash and tied it around Charlie. "Your niece will tremble, poor fellow," he said, "so I'll just climb in the window and hoist you to me with the leash. I should have lashed you down right away." "It would have been better," replied Charlie Brand, "because I hurt my knees and hands in that slide." "Better than breaking your neck." At these words the great stranger climbed up the roof like a cat and crawled through the open window. Now it was easy for him to hoist his friend, and in a few minutes he was standing beside him in the attic of the house in which the jeweler Morton's shop was located. John Raffles, who always provided himself with everything necessary on his nightly journeys, took out a bottle of brandy and let Charlie drink from it. Sufficiently refreshed, Charlie Brand now followed his friend. Through all manner of clutter they passed through the attic and reached the stairs of the house through an unlocked door. It was completely dark here and no sound was heard. They slid softly down the railing. When they had entered the passage, John Raffles went to the room behind the shop, where, he understood, the jeweler usually slept. So, since he was on a journey, either the room had to be empty, or the young man, who pretended to be Morton's representative, had to be there. John Raffles listened for seconds at the door, and when he heard no sound, he gently lowered the latch. To his great surprise, the door opened of its own accord with a soft, squeaking sound. The great stranger immediately held the door and, to avoid all further noise, took an oil can from his tool bag and greased the handles. Then he entered the room. For an indivisible moment he let the light of his flashlight shine across the room. He saw that the room was furnished with antiques and that on the right side, near a stove, was the bed. In this, Mr. Morton lay asleep. At first Raffles didn't think he could see well, because the jeweler was on a trip, wasn't he? Silently he crept to the couch, leaned over it, and listened. After a few minutes Charlie Brand, who had stopped at a distance, heard Raffles exclaim, "Devilish!" The man is dead. Come here, Charlie. Charlie crept in and saw the great unknown cast the light of his flashlight upon Mr. Morton's face. Lord Lister placed his hand on the jeweler's forehead and felt that it was icy cold. He shook the body from side to side and examined the heartbeat. In vain. Mr. Morton did not move, and both friends realized that they had a corpse in front of them. Now the friends began to examine the corpse to see if the body showed any signs of violence. But they found nothing. The man was killed, Raffles told Charlie Brand, but it's the strangest way to kill someone I've ever discovered. He has no wounds, his death is a mystery to me. But you see, Charlie, I was right. Last night we saw this man standing in his shop, and this morning a young man told me that Mr. Morton was on a journey. I am now curious to know how all this works, and above all I want to find out whether the pearls are in the safe of the deceased. At this moment steps were heard on the first floor. Instantly Raffles turned out the light and listened. He heard the indistinct murmur of two voices. Upstairs a door opened, and they clearly heard a man's voice speaking in broken English with an Italian accent. You will be mistaken, mio amigo. But in any case take your revolver with you, we'll go and have a look. They are coming, whispered Charlie Brand. What should we do? John Raffles thought for a few seconds. The room was not a good place for a hiding place, and the two Italians would certainly search everything. Lie down beside the dead man, ordered Raffles, lighting his lantern again. With a shiver of horror, Charlie Brand stretched out in the bed, and Raffles laid the duvet over his friend so neatly that there was nothing left of him to be seen. Then he himself lay down on the other side of the deceased, put out the light, and now pulled the duvet over himself too, so that nothing betrayed his presence. Lord Lister was able to survey the room through a small opening. He clearly recognized the young man who had served him that afternoon, accompanied by an elderly man. The latter carried a kerosene lamp and lit the room with it. As Raffles would have guessed, the men looked under the bed, opened the cupboard, and then went into the shop. After a few minutes they returned, and the eldest said, "You see that you were mistaken, or do you perhaps think that the dead man has come back to life and is looking around his house to see if everything is all right? Don't worry, it won't come alive anymore." With a cry of horror the young man clutched his companion's arm and cried, "All Saints! Pietro, the dead man is moving." "You are a coward," said the person called Pietro, "a great coward. The flickering light is deceiving you." But at this moment he too was seized with a panic. With eyes filled with horror, both stared at the dead man and saw his right arm rise slowly and make a menacing movement against them. With a savage scream they fled and rushed to the stairs. The two intruders heard them carefully shut the door of their room on the first floor. Immediately Raffles and Charlie Brand jumped out of the bed. "Now we are undisturbed," laughed Raffles, "all night. The bandits won't come back. I gave them a great terror by moving the arm of the corpse. Now we can easily find Mr. Investigate Morton. Now go into the shop, lie down behind the door, and as soon as you hear the steps of someone in the street, give me a sign that I may hide behind the counter in the brightly lit shop." Charlie Brand did as he was told, while his friend made his way to the safe with his tools. Charlie repeatedly gave the agreed signal, and each time Raffles hid behind the counter until the passerby had passed the house. After half an hour of work he had opened the safe and took out a box with loose-cut diamonds and a necklace of pearls from a case. They were 80 extraordinarily beautiful, Montrose Indian pearls. He found no other valuables in the safe and, having closed it, left the shop. In the dead man's room he found receipts and some stamps from Morton. With these stamps he signed the receipt, then he took from the writing desk a letter with Morton's signature and put it with the receipts in his breast pocket. After this he and Charlie Brand crept back up the stairs for a long time, and together they left the house by the same way they had come. Half an hour later they were walking back down Lincoln Street, hands in trouser pockets. They reached their house about 4 o'clock in the morning. Chapter 3. Cheated Goodthans. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning when John Raffles already entered the jeweler Morton's shop with Charlie Brand. The shop was empty, and they had to wait a while before the young man who had served them the day before appeared. Before John Raffles could say anything, the young man spoke nervously. "I am sorry to tell you that I am not yet in a position to sell you the pearl necklace, because the lady has not yet sent it back to me. I'm afraid the necklace I carelessly sent to a hotel has been taken from me." "So," replied Lord Lister, drawing out his wallet, from which he took a receipt from Mr. Morton. This receipt, which he had brought with him that night, he had completed at home to the amount of £2,000 sterling, with the remark that this money would be refunded should Morton not return the pearl necklace, which was supposed to cost £5,000 sterling owned. Then be so kind as to repay me the sum of £2,000 sterling. I don't want to buy the pearls now. The young man drummed his fingers nervously on the counter, not knowing what to answer. I don't have much time, said the customer. Give me my money back. I'm sorry, replied the salesman. Mr. Morton didn't leave that amount here. You must be patient till Sir returns. John Raffles quietly amused himself with the cornered criminal. He kept it like a pike on a rod. It is a pity, he said, but I need my money to buy a pearl necklace elsewhere. I'll give you an hour. You can meanwhile Mr. Telegraph Morton or somehow try to borrow the money. If I don't get the amount in an hour, I'll have to go to the police and ask Mr. Morton to be charged with embezzlement. Without greeting he left the shop with Charlie Brand and went to a restaurant across the street. While they were having breakfast there, he said to Charlie, "A wonderful thing. That story amuses me more than the best comedy. These criminals have spared no effort and time, and moreover committed a grievous crime to come into possession of the jeweler's business, and now they must, without their power to do anything about it, surrender all their loot to me. The silver and gold work in the shop is not worth more than £2,000 sterling." After an hour he got up and went into the shop. Besides the young man, his older friend also stood here. The great stranger saw that he looked at him with suspicious looks. "Have you the money?" asked Raffles. "Yes," replied the young man, "I got the money, for I could not reach Mr. Morton." He opened the treasury and took from it several packets of English banknotes, which he handed to Lord Lister. Slowly Raffles counted the bills and after putting the receipt on the counter, he put the money in his breast pocket with the words, "It is strange that Mr. Morton, with whom I have been doing business for many years and whom I know as a very punctual, experienced merchant, let this great sale slip from me. Would you greet my lord for me?" With an ironic smile he left the house again. As he was about to close the door behind him, he heard one of the two gentlemen in a low tone, "Cursed fellow," muttered. John Raffles closed the door, lit a cigarette and left, smoking happily. "Now I will turn the villains over to Scotland Yard," he said to Charlie Brand, "that my friend Baxter may have some work to do again. That guy seems to be sleeping again." He drove home in a rental car. After half an hour he left the house again, in the disguise of an old grey English naval captain, Charlie Brand disguised as a red-haired Irish servant, and they returned by carriage to Morton's jeweller's shop. As he entered, he found the young man unpacking several chests containing gold and silverware. "I come here," said John Raffles, producing a letter stamped with Morton's stamp, "in response to a letter from Mr. Morton, who sent it to me a week ago and offered to sell his house. Is that Mr. Morton present?" "It pains me, but Mr. Morton is temporarily traveling," came the reply. "Traveling?" repeated Raffles in the tone of the utmost astonishment. "Traveling? But Mr. Morton wrote to me that he was expecting me today." "I'm sorry," replied the young man, "Mr. Morton had to travel on urgent matters." "That is a great pity," said the new visitor, "because I could only get a few hours' leave and must return to my ship this evening. Then you'll be so kind as to show me the house, won't you?" The young man did not know what to answer. Distraught, he stared at John Raffles and Charlie Brand. "I know the house from the old days," the alleged buyer began again. "If I remember correctly, a large room adjoins this shop with an exit to the courtyard. Surely you will allow me to have a look?" Without waiting for an answer, Raffles passed behind the counter and was already about to open the door to the room, when suddenly the young man sprang like a cat at the intruder, knocked him off the door, and exclaimed, "Halt, sir! Mr. Morton has expressly forbidden me to admit anyone into the rooms during his absence." "Don't make fun of yourself," replied the captain, placing his right hand, almost benignly, on the young man's shoulder. He tried in vain to avoid this. Before he could say anything, Raffles had opened the door to the room, and a loud exclamation of pretended surprise escaped him. He stared at the jeweler, lying in bed, whose dead face was kneaded on the pillow. At this moment the young man, who was still being held by Raffles, tried to tear himself free and flee. But the alleged purchaser held him down and, having struck him on the forehead, laid the unconscious young man on the ground. He then went to the telephone in the room and had himself connected to the police headquarters, Scotland Yard. "Send several able men at once to 16 Lincoln Street, home of the jeweller Morton," asked Raffles the Scotland Yard clerk. "A great crime has been committed there." In less than 10 minutes a police car arrived in front of the shop, and the great stranger, looking through the shop windows at the persons getting out, said to Charlie Brand, "Naturally. Our old friend, Inspector Baxter, personally gives himself the great honor of discovering a crime." So it was. The inspector of police entered the shop first, and John Raffles introduced himself to him as the captain of the English Navy, Sir Charles Lobster. In short words, showing him Morton's letter, which the officer could not suspect that Lord Lister himself had written to him, he told him that the young man had lied to him and told him that the jeweller Morton was on a journey, while the man in the room behind the shop lay dead in his bed. This lie had prompted him to enlist the help of the police. "Thank you," said Baxter, saluting in a military manner. "We will put the handcuffs on the lad at once as a precaution." The officers handcuffed the young man, and as they placed the steel bands on his wrists, the sleeve of the forearm shifted and Detective Mahome recoiled suddenly, as if he had grasped a hot iron. He spoke to Baxter, pointing to the bare forearm of the shackled. "Look at that tattoo, Inspector Baxter." Baxter, the officers, John Raffles and Charlie Brand all looked up and saw on the left arm a black burned right hand with outstretched fingers. "The sign of the Black Hand," said Baxter. "Accursed. We are dealing here with the worst criminals. That man there is a member of the secret society of the Italian Camorra." At this moment the door of the room was flung open, and the elder companion of the bound Italian rushed in, holding a revolver in the right hand, a dagger in the left. "Maledetto!" he roared, "what do you want here?" "Capture you!" exclaimed Baxter. "The devil gathers you all together," replied the Italian, pointing his revolver at Baxter. But at the same instant a shot rang out behind Baxter. With a curse, the Italian dropped the raised revolver and a stream of blood gushed from his right hand. The detectives seized him, took the dagger from him, and bound him in spite of all opposition. "Who shot the fellow?" asked Baxter. "I did," John Raffles replied calmly, lighting a cigarette. The police inspector bowed, and said, "Then you probably saved my life, sir." The naval officer smiled. "It is my great pleasure to save you alive, Sir Inspector. I would miss you very much." Now came the voice of Detective Mahome, calling to his superior. "Look, Inspector. This man too has on his left arm the secret mark of the Camorra." Baxter glanced at this briefly, then went with the police doctor who had accompanied him to examine the dead man. The doctor declared, however, that it was impossible to determine for the time being whether the jeweller had died a natural or a violent death. "Then we'll search the house," ordered Baxter, and all made their way to the higher chambers. Here, however, they found nothing suspicious. Only a boundless confusion showed that the rooms had not been cleaned for days. In one of the rooms, the clothes lying around indicated that it was occupied by a woman. But in vain the detectives searched the house, the lady was not to be found. And yet Baxter and Raffles both hoped to learn more from her about Morton's death. Where had she gone and who was she? In this room Raffles found a white beard in a table drawer. The detectives looked at him with great interest and puzzled in vain as to what purpose he had been used for. But Raffles understood the custom. He held the beard up to the eldest Italian's face and said, laughing, "Here's Mr. Morton, gentlemen, though he doesn't seem to speak." A furious look was thrown at him by the handcuffed man. Raffles had discovered his secret. This Italian was the false Mr. Morton, who, instead of the dead man, showed the jewels to the lady in the shop. Baxter had called for some residents from the adjoining houses to find out who Mr. Morton's servants had been, and whether they might know where they had gone. To the astonishment of Inspector Baxter, and also of John Raffles, Morton's neighbors designated the eldest Italian as the deceased's servant. On the other hand, they could give no information as to the appearance of the housekeeper, and the two shackled Camorrists were silent. Only Raffles knew what the housekeeper looked like. It must be the lady he had seen in the shop that night with the thief's lantern, a beautiful fair-haired woman. An unusual sight, and Lord Lister spoke to himself that he would find this lady among the demi-mondaines in the Piccadilly Circus or after theatre in the Strand restaurants. He bade farewell to Baxter, and promised to see him the next day in Scotland Yard. When Lord Lister had already left the shop, Baxter called to Detective Mahome. "Look after the captain, I forgot to ask him for his address." And Mahome ran after Raffles as fast as his short legs could carry him, and found him just about to drive off in a car. "Wait a minute, if you please," he cried almost breathlessly. The great unknown halted the driver for a moment, and asked the approaching Mahome what he wished. "Monsieur Inspector wants your address," exclaimed the detective. "He needs it for his deeds." "Fine," replied Raffles, "here's my ticket." He took a card from his business book, folded it in half and handed it to Mahome. "Greet the Inspector of Police Baxter for me and repeat to him that I am delighted to have saved his life," he cried to Mahome, and at the same moment he ordered the driver to drive away. "I will deliver the message." Mahome could still shout, then the car chugged away and after a minute had disappeared into the bustle of people and vehicles. Mahome walked slowly back to the jewelry store to bring Baxter the captain's calling card. As he walked he unfolded the card to read the address. He suddenly had to stop, and a loud cry alerted the passers-by to him. Then he burst out laughing and the bystanders thought he was drunk or insane as he went on, spluttering and laughing. And he still laughed as he handed his chief Baxter the card, and as soon as he read the name, he jumped up as if stung by a wasp and exclaimed, "Raffles!" "Yes," gasped Mahome, almost choking, "John C. Raffles is sending us his calling card. Guys, the great unknown deserves to be a London police inspector." The detectives laughed. But the captivated Camorrists gave each other a look of understanding. They now knew who had entrapped them, and they swore a bloody revenge on Raffles. Chapter 4. In the House of the Bloody. Already that very evening the London papers had long articles on the capture of two members of the dreaded Black Hand and the strange circumstances under which it had taken place. "John Raffles, the thug detective!" shouted the paper boys, giving the great unknown a new title of honor. A deeply veiled lady bought an evening paper from one of the boys at the Strand. She seemed to be in great haste, for she did not wait for the change the boy wanted to give her back. The boy looked after her in astonishment. He thought she had made a mistake, and as he was an honest fellow, he ran after her and overtook her just as she climbed into a car. "Keep the money," the lady called to him and the car disappeared. In the closed car she threw back the veil that covered her face, and with trembling hands she opened the evening paper. Raffles smarter than the Black Hand. Read the headline of the sensational article on the first page, followed by the description of the events in Morton's shop. As she read, an expression of anger appeared on the lady's face, giving her Madonna-like fair face a devilish look. Her full lips were pressed together tightly, and when she had finished reading the article she squeezed the paper and whispered, "We have been exposed, cursed." Angrily she stamped her small, elegantly shod foot on the floor of the carriage. To calm herself she took a cigarette from her handbag and lit it. She looked thoughtfully at the bustling street. Her countenance had a hard, determined expression, and a dangerous light shot from her beautiful eyes, like the lurking glances of a cat seeking its prey in the dark. It was a great journey she made. The car drove from the Strand over the Thames to the Tower. Near Tower Bridge the lady signalled the driver to halt and called a passing man with a black beard. The latter, startled, when he heard his name, ran to the car, and the driver heard the stranger hastily exchange a few words in Italian. Then he called to the driver, "Go on," and sat down with the lady. "What about the capture of our comrades, Charlotte?" the lady asked. "A cursed story, Miss Tony," replied the black man. "I just learned it from the papers there and thought about going straight to the clubhouse. We must find a means of freeing the captives and, what is more important, making Raffles harmless. If we catch him, he must be tortured in an unprecedented way." The man with the black beard answered with a shrug. "I believe we will succeed in the liberation of our comrades, but I doubt whether we shall be able to bring Raffles into our power." Again the lady stamped her foot furiously, and exclaimed, "It must. He should have thought it sufficient to take what was stolen from Pietro and Jimmy." The whole affair with the buyer of the pearl necklace immediately struck me as suspicious. I suspected a detective. No one could have guessed that we were dealing with the great unknown. It was stupid of me. I shouldn't have returned the pearl necklace to Jimmy and Pietro yesterday. But they were afraid of a discovery and, moreover, wanted to sell the jewel for a profit. This was a good opportunity for them now, and we would now be in possession of several £1,000s sterling, if not. She paused, biting her lower lip angrily. The Black said, laughing. If Raffles hadn't come and taken the pearl necklace from you, plus £2,000 sterling, and delivered the two fools to Scotland Yard. It's actually ridiculous, even though they're my buddies. Unfortunately, this Raffles was supposed to be chairman of the Black Hand. I believe we would then be able to submerge all of London in the Channel and only be left with the money. Your judgment is very peculiar, replied Miss Tony. Our misfortune seems to amuse you. No, but it is Raffles' masterpiece, said the other. Otherwise I take your view, Miss Tony, that it is our duty to put a razor down the throat of anyone who harms our comrades. The car stopped at the corner of a dark street and Miss Tony exited the vehicle with the dark-haired man. After paying the driver, they walked into the dark street and stopped in front of a modest two-story house. A high stoop led to the front door, and below the bell a porcelain sign read, Dr. Sabatini. Doctor and midwife. An old woman opened the door and let them in, muttering an Italian greeting. Miss Tony seemed to know the house, for without question she went up the stairs and without knocking entered a room where several men sat together. Their tanned faces and black beards clearly betrayed that they were Italians. With southern vivacity they greeted Miss Tony and her handler and gallantly helped the girl take off her fur coat. The men appeared to be civilized and well-behaved gentlemen. They were dressed with careful elegance and appeared to be of Italian nobility, for Miss Tony called them Count and Baron. No one had suspected in these gentlemen the heads of the infamous Camorra, the Black Hand. Where's Dr. Sabatini? Miss Tony asked one of them. He has a conference with Sergei Ivanovich in the side room. The Russian has come today with important messages from Petersburg. A new revolution is being prepared there, and we now hope to gain more advantage from it than from the last one, where those cowardly revolutionaries feared the government. I think it is more important to speak at once with Dr. Sabatini about the liberation of our comrades, replied Miss Tony. Don't worry, said another, the comrades of our detective division have just received their orders from Dr. Sabatini. It is almost certain that already tonight the prisoners will be released and come here. A silver bell rang in the adjoining room. This was the sign that Dr. Sabatini had finished his conference and that the waiting could enter. Miss Tony opened the door and, followed by the Camorrists, entered Sabatini's room. The room was filled with heavy, dark furniture. A beautifully carved writing table stood close to the windows, which were covered by heavy velvet curtains. Two burning candles in tall silver candlesticks cast their light over a multitude of papers on the writing table and upon an old man with a white beard, who sat at the writing desk, and whose appearance was reminiscent of that of a doge of Venice of ancient times. This was Dr. Sabatini, the chief of the Black Hand, the president of the most feared and dangerous criminal association in the world. No one would have suspected that old man, with his benevolent and venerable countenance, of one of those terrible crimes which he had committed, and yet a tiger could not be more cruel than this old man. He proudly called himself the Bloodthirsty. In reverent attitude, the incoming stood in the doorway, and only Miss Tony, at a wave of the old man's hand, was allowed to sit on a chair beside the writing table, after the Russian Ivanovich had risen from this seat. Dr. Sabatini looked sharply and penetratingly at Miss Tony and said, "What boundless stupidity have you committed?" "A stupidity?" asked Miss Tony in a low voice. "Absolutely, a stupidity," repeated Dr. Sabatini. "When Morton was dead you should have taken everything of value with you and made it disappear." "We hoped," replied the girl, "to sell the pieces of value from the store at good prices. That's why we stayed." "The stupid ones will be punished," said Dr. Sabatini. "I'll send them to our New York branch and they'll have to start there as newbies again. It is simply inconceivable how you could have spoiled a matter so well prepared. I had succeeded in placing Pietro as a domestic servant at the jeweler's recommendations and also you as a housekeeper. And after that, when the man had been helped by me into eternity without a look, and you had his pearls and diamonds at your disposal, let that rascal of Raffles overwhelm you." He turned to the Camorrists, who had stopped at the door, and said, "I have devised a plan to punish the great unknown and his accomplice. Within 3 days this man will be sentenced to death for his audacity in handing over 2 of our comrades to the police. Here is the verdict, Count Albergo." This one approached Drive Sabatini and received a sheet of paper, which bore a black hand, a skull and 2 crossbones underneath, and on which was written the death sentence of John C. Raffles. After the Earl read through the writing, Dr. Sabatini presented him with a place setting on which the correct address of Lord Edward Lister alias John Raffles had been written on the typewriter. "This letter must be brought to the man this very night," ordered Dr. Sabatini, "and here's the plan. If you follow it carefully, the great unknown will no longer be of the living in 3 days." He made a wave of his hand as a sign that he did not wish to be troubled any further. With a reverent bow, the Camorrists bid farewell as Miss Stoney extended her hand from Dr. Sabatini, on which glittered an extraordinarily large, beautiful diamond, pressed to her lips. Then she, too, left the room. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when the house bell at Lord Lister's house in Regent Park rang out, and the old valet, awakened from his sleep, saw through the small window in the front door the dark figure of a man who, at his question, what he wished, replied, "Here is a momentous letter which he must give to Lord Lister this very night." Through the opening he slid the letter to the servant and disappeared. He went into Lord Lister's bedroom to wake his master. Raffles opened the letter and read it calmly. He then dressed quickly and made his way to Charlie Brand's bedroom, 1 floor above. Startled, Charlie jumped up and shouted, "Did something happen?" "Nothing of importance," replied Raffles, "only my death sentence was sent to me." "Your death sentence?" repeated Charlie Brand, without understanding. "Have you committed a murder?" "Not that," replied Raffles, "but I took the liberty of handing over 2 members of a gang of murderers to the police. This death sentence includes yours, by the way, my boy." "I think it's an unpleasant affair," said Charlie Brand. "I don't feel like dying a violent death yet. What do you think to do?" "We'll move into the small 2-story house on Webster Street early tomorrow," replied Raffles, "which I rented for 2 months. We'll have to avoid our present home for a while until I've dealt with that gang of criminals. This case is a little more serious than one with one of the Lords of Scotland Yard. They are brutal villains with whom we have to deal, but I will speak to them. This will be an interesting case." Chapter 5. List against List. Webster Street was a narrow, dark street, and within it was the small, narrow house which Raffles had rented for several months to have a place of refuge in addition to his villa. It was only 3 windows wide and furnished for 1 family only. The previous owner had died, and John Raffles had rented the house and all its contents from the heirs. "We must serve ourselves here for a while," said the great stranger to his friend, after they entered the house. "I don't want anyone in the neighborhood to notice that this house is occupied. We will keep the shutters closed, and the heavy curtains hanging over the windows allow us to burn light inside, without anyone on the street noticing. And now we will make it easy on ourselves for everything. I'll set up the stove, and you can buy provisions and whatever else you may need in the meantime." An hour later they were sitting by a merry fire, drinking a cup of tea, and Raffles recounted to Charlie Brand events from his former life in India and Africa. When it got dark, Raffles turned off the lamp in the room and opened the curtains on the windows. Through the cracks in the closed shutters he could see down the narrow street, for a lantern in front of the house gave enough light. John Raffles had looked down the ass for a few minutes when he turned to Charlie Brand and said, "Come here, Charlie, and look at the man who sits opposite our house in that old portico, looking at our house with apparently so attentiveness as if it were Westminster Abbey or the King's Palace." Charlie Brand went to his friend and looked at the dark figure across the street. "What do you keep that man for?" asked Raffles. Charlie replied, "I can't see his face, he has his hat pulled over his forehead. But to judge by his dress, he is an Italian barrel organ man, such as one often sees in the streets of London." "You are right," replied Raffles, "it is not a detective, but an Italian organ grinder. A detective doesn't choose such a disguise, it would be too conspicuous. And when one changes oneself, one must not stand out, or one must represent a clergyman, an official, or a soldier, someone for whom people respect." "What interest could that man have in looking at our house?" "You are a fool," said John Raffles. "Despite all my precautions, those scoundrels, those Camorrists, have succeeded in following our trail, and that man stands there alone on the other side of us. It's one of the Camorrists, and I'll bet £10 for a plum seed, as usual, I'm right. All Italians outside their country, all organ grinders and fruit merchants in London belong to the Camorra. But I'll make the man over there a little uncomfortable. I don't want him to be a sentry for the house. And those people should know that I'm not afraid of them. Every English criminal who died on our gallows is a gentleman compared to those cowardly, suspicious, murderous scoundrels. They are devils in human form. They have no respect for age or gender. And now, Charlie, you must show that you are a worthy disciple of mine. You've got to get that fellow out. Best, replied Charlie. Tell me what to do. Listen, replied Raffles, you leave the house through the patio door. Then climb over the fences of the adjacent gardens to the fourth house from here. I already looked at all that when I bought the house. It is without any danger and very easy to do. The fourth house is uninhabited. Here's a key to it, it fits on the front door. Through that door, which you leave open, you enter the street. First go a little to the right, go to the other side and then come back to the side where the Italian is standing. As soon as you get to the fellow, stand close to him, light your pipe, and smoke him in the face to provoke him. Leave everything else to me. I think the fellow will be gone soon. I will use this moment by following him. You then return to the house and guard it, so that none of those black-haired thugs can sneak up on us. Charlie Brand got ready. Then he opened a secret cabinet in the hallway, in which several weapons hung. He took a revolver and wanted to put it in his pocket. But Raffles spoke, shaking his head. Put that gun back in its place, Charlie, it's no use carrying that heavy thing. In a battle with the Camorrists it would be of no use. They are far too crafty to fight man to man. They always attack someone in the back. Shall I go unarmed then? Yes, replied Raffles, I will be your weapon, and I hope you do not doubt its soundness. No, said Charlie Brand, you have already rescued me from the most painful circumstances, without a hair of my head ever being hurt. Go now. Lord Lister led his boyfriend to the back door, opened it and said, Count 4 gardens accurately. See you next time. Charlie then disappeared over the fence. Raffles went back to the window to see the effect of Charlie's arrival on the stranger. It took a quarter of an hour before Charlie sauntered down the street. With his hands in the pockets of his overcoat and his collar up high, he blew thick clouds of tobacco in the face of the Italian as he approached it. Raffles laughed softly and whispered, He does it very cleverly. And as if to smoke it through, Charlie Brand incessantly blew the smoke of his tobacco pipe into the stranger's face. Now the organ grinder took a few steps more to the left. Charlie immediately followed him. But now the man got angry. With a furious gesture he turned and cried in a tone so loud that Raffles could hear it behind the closed shutters. Maledetto! Are you looking for a quarrel with me? Charlie Brand laughed contemptuously and spat in English fashion at the Italian's feet. In reply the other uttered a crude Italian curse. Charlie Brand spat again and said, Let the devil get you, yellow Italian. If you stand in my way and stop me from spitting where I please, I'll give you a good jab in the ribs in true English fashion. Charlie did an excellent job of imitating the speech of an Irishman. But the other remained curiously calm despite the heavy insult. In the half-darkness of the street Raffles saw the Italian light a cigar. Then he moved on slowly. Charlie followed. Now both were so far away that the great unknown could only see them indistinctly. Charlie Brand must have uttered another insult. There resounded from the other side of the street the hasty steps of a man. Instantly Raffles suspected that this man's arrival was connected with the Italian and Charlie Brand. For a few seconds he listened breathlessly, and he saw a male figure prowl like a beast of prey along the street towards the two contenders. A short exchange of words followed, then some loud English curses, and at last a cry rang out. Raffles! Raffles! Now he put a fur cap over his head, hastily donned a coat with a Browning pistol in it, and stormed out into the street. Only a few seconds could have passed since he had heard the cry. But there was no trace of Charlie Brand in the street, only a broken tobacco pipe on the pavement. This was a strong piece even for Raffles. He thought. Fire was not alone. He was with the Italian and the other man. With the help of this third the Italian had overpowered Charlie and dragged him away. Yet, 3 people could not possibly disappear without a trace in London. They must be found. The great unknown raced down the street to the corner of Liverpool Street. There stood a police officer in comfort, to whom Raffles shouted. Did you see 3 men here a few moments ago, coming down from Webster Street? "Yes, sir," the agent replied politely. "Which road did they take?" asked Raffles. The police officer thought for a moment and replied, "They went across the street to the corner opposite, or rather two of them walked and dragged a third, who had apparently had too much to drink. That man was not drunk, but knocked unconscious by a blow. You should have seen that." "It is none of my business, sir," replied the agent, "to investigate what I cannot know." The men took a carriage over there and drove toward the Thames. "Do you know the coachman?" Raffles asked nervously. "No, sir, carriages seldom come into this part of town. If, however, you suspect a crime, I will summon help." "That's pointless," replied Raffles, "I'll handle the business alone." Slowly he went back to his house. He had forgotten to close in his excitement and was worried that someone might have crept in. But his fears proved unfounded. During his search he found no one and, lost in thought, sat down by the hearth. He had to come to Charlie Brand's aid. Those guys held a short trial. Suddenly he heard the distinct creaking of planks overhead, as one hears when someone walks on them. John Raffles listened with intense attention. But immediately everything was calm again. He got up and walked to the door that led into the hallway. When he stood close and was about to open the door, he saw that the handle was moving. Lightning fast, he pushed the bolt that was on the door. In reply came a loud Italian curse. Raffles did not own a weapon. His overcoat, which contained the revolver, hung in the hallway. He thought for a moment, then he stepped to the window and looked out. He saw that the organ grinder was again facing his house. He had no longer pulled the hat so deeply over his eyes, and Raffles noticed that the man had a full beard. He immediately took from his breast pocket a pack of Blackbeard wool, which he always carried with him so that he could quickly disguise himself. He fastened the black beard to his chin with adhesive, and with the aid of a mirror he masterfully changed his face, while his enemies on the other side of the door tried in vain to open it. Then he rushed through a small back room adjoining the garden, opened the window of this room softly, and sprang out silently. A few minutes later the Italian saw someone approaching in the street and signaled his companions, who were in Raffles's house. The stranger, meanwhile, had come close and, drinking a cigarette, he begged the Italian who was on guard for fire. He willingly wanted to take out a box of matches, but already he received a blow to the temple and fell unconscious. The stranger hastily bent over him, took his hat off his head, took off his overcoat and put on his own clothes. He tied the Italian with the leather thongs he was carrying, and then twisted a wad of his handkerchief. He put it in the unconscious man's mouth, and opened the nearest door with a sledgehammer. Behind this he laid the man down, then closed the door again, and took the Italian's place himself. He had to wait a quarter of an hour, then he saw some men coming out of his house, who approached him cursing. "He has fled. We are now going to the club. Follow us." One of the men spoke to him in a low tone. Raffles followed his enemies and thought of a plan how he might save himself from the clutches of this whole mob. He understood that he was dealing with brash fellows who would stop at nothing. He carried no weapons with him except for a cloth which he had found in the jacket pocket of the gagged Italian. After a half-hour walk, the Italians stopped in front of a small house. After a certain sign the front door was opened and they disappeared. Resolutely, Raffles also stood at the door, where he imitated the signal he had overheard, and without hesitation the door was opened to him too. An old Italian woman let him in. At the end of the hall a door stood half open, and the room was filled with savage screaming male voices. They were curses they uttered because Raffles had fled from them. Then one of the Italians shouted, "Doctor, Sabatini has ordered that Raffles' accomplice, imprisoned in the cellar, be packed in a sack, weighed down with millstones, and thrown into the Thames this very night." No sooner had Raffles heard these words than he crept down the stairs leading to the cellar, where in an enclosed area he heard the groans and sighs of a man. A simple lock, which Raffles opened without difficulty, gave him access, and in the next instant he found himself with Charlie Brand, who lay on the floor. He hastily released his fetters, pulled the gag from his mouth, and asked in a whisper, "It's me. Can you walk?" "Yes," Charlie replied softly. "I can run like the best English greyhound." "All right," said his friend, "follow me then and don't worry about anything. Just make sure you get away. Don't worry about me, come what may." Holding Charlie Brand's hand, he led him down the stairs into the hallway. There sat the old Italian woman knitting. When she saw the two men she wanted to scream, but already John Raffles shut her mouth. Then he called out to Charlie Brand. "Slide the bolts back from the door, and now forward. I follow." Charlie hastily obeyed this command, and all he could hear was Raffles calling to him softly. RP. This was the agreed-upon name for their Regent Park residence. Then Charlie Brand ran as fast as his feet could carry him out into the street, and he was soon out of sight. He no longer saw the desperate fight in which his friend was entangled. The old woman had held the wrists of the great unknown with superhuman strength, and their struggle had knocked the chair on which the old woman sat. This noise had lured the Camorrists out of the back room into the hallway. Like a pack of wolves, they charged on Raffles and overpowered him, despite his desperate self-defense. Chapter 6. Finally delivered. 20 pairs of eyes stared at Raffles with hatred as he lay heavily cuffed on the floor in the back room. The thugs shouted the vilest curses at him when the door was suddenly opened and several men with Dr. Sabatini appeared. Immediately there was a deep silence. No one dared move, so great was their awe for the bloodthirsty. The benevolent smile had now disappeared from his face. He now showed himself in his true form. His eyebrows were squinted, and he looked sharply at Raffles. "Well, are you there?" he said to the captive. "I like that." "Not less for me," laughed the great unknown. "I have long wished to know the greatest villain in the whole world." "Dog rag," hissed the bloodthirsty. "Well, there wasn't much for you to steal here." "Oh, I do." Raffles laughed with satisfaction. "I stole my friend." The bloodthirsty looked at his men in astonishment. They had not yet told him about Charlie Brand's flight. "Where is this fellow's accomplice?" asked Dr. Sabatini. "Free and flee," replied one of the Camorrists. "Devil!" cursed Dr. Sabatini. "And whose fault is that? Who was on watch?" "We didn't keep watch here in the house for necessity," replied Count Albergo. "That man must be back in our power tomorrow. He knows our secret locally and is therefore dangerous for us. When you have found him, cut his throat at once. He must not betray anything." Now the bloodthirsty spoke to Raffles again. "You must know why you must die. You will no longer experience tomorrow. It would have been wiser if you had not meddled in our affairs. It has long been my plan to punish you for your crimes, Dr. Sabatini. Our police are no match for you. That's why I consider it my sport to stand up for her and show you that all those murders don't go unpunished. Such scoundrels, who make a profession of cutting the throats of their fellows, belong to the gallows, and I shall soon have the pleasure of seeing you hanged upon it." A scream of anger interrupted Raffles's words. The old man stood before him, fists clenched, and a look of deadly hatred struck the great unknown. "Take him," ordered the bloodthirsty. "Where should he die?" asked Count Albergo. "You fool," laughed Raffles, "if you don't hurry, my friend will send you all Scotland Yard on your roof." "Maledetto!" cursed Dr. Sabatini. "That is true. We must leave this house. So let us hasten and meet in my house. Tomorrow we will pay a visit to his house. I hope it will be worth what he stole for us. Take him in the upstairs room. I'll treat him there myself. Where's Miss Tony?" "She is waiting for me in the restaurant Monty," replied Count Albergo. Now several fellows grabbed Raffles and dragged him down a flight of stairs to a higher floor. In a dark room they tied him to a chair. Dr. Sabatini brought an alarm clock, a timepiece as seen in cheap shops. But the long pointer had been unscrewed, and in its place was a narrow, razor-sharp razor. Dr. Sabatini set the clockwork on a pillar. He then tied to a hook fastened to the ceiling a long silk thread which ran close to the clockwork, so that the razor reaching over the edge had to cut the thread at a certain point. To this thread Dr. Sabatini a dynamite bomb a few centimeters below the watch. After the detonation of this infernal machine, the police would not be able to find much more here. "Set the alarm clock to do its work in 5 minutes, said Dr. Sabatini to Count Albergo, "and then immediately leave the house. I'm afraid the fugitive has alerted the police. Forward. Put the prisoner in front of the clock. He can enjoy his last moments." The Camorrists pushed Raffles close to the clockwork. Then they examined his chains again and left. Dr. Sabatini, who remained the longest, said to the captive, "You see that you have finally found your master. Pleasant trip." With a scornful laugh he went to the door. But John Raffles called after him. "Remember, I promised you the gallows." "Dog rag!" exclaims the other angrily. He then left the room and closed the door. A few seconds later the Camorrists had left the house. Raffles breathed again. "Stupid fellows," he said to himself, "they think they're sending me like a balloon to the other world, and they forget that first of all they need my own permission. So get to work." The lighted candle on the table gave out enough light to make the great unknown's work easier. He pushed forward slowly with the chair to which he had been handcuffed. Cautiously he leaned forward, picked up the alarm clock with his mouth and threw it on the floor. Now he dropped himself too and lay down so that his right hand, which was tied to one of the chair legs, could grasp the razor. In a few moments Raffles had freed himself from his fetters. He stretched out his limbs, then went to the door and opened it with a small spanner he had in his waistcoat pocket. He now hastily left the house through the garden door, for he suspected that a Camorrist guard was guarding the house. Like a cat he jumped over the fences of the adjacent gardens and at last he reached the street through an empty building. From there he could see the house in which he had been imprisoned. Two men stood across the street looking at it. Raffles laughed and walked on. He went into a little shop and bought himself with the last piece of money he had cigarettes. As he continued, smoking comfortably, he suddenly heard a tremendous explosion at the end of the street. At the same time the two men, whom Raffles had seen standing in front of the house, rushed down the street and shouted, "Fire! Fire!" People poured in from all sides and at last the fire brigade and police arrived. There was nothing left to save. The house was completely destroyed and the fire brigade assumed a gas explosion as the cause. But Raffles knew better. He had taken a carriage and was driving home. Charlie Brand waited for him in nervous suspense and received him with the words, "Where have you been so long?" "They made me fly in the air," laughed Raffles. "The Camorrists helped me to the other world with a dynamite cartridge." "Raffles is dead, long live Raffles." The great unknown now spoke in a more serious tone. "And now, my boy, pay the coachman who waits at the door, and I'll go to supper. It is becoming time." After supper Raffles dressed carefully and spoke to Charlie Brand. "You must come with me now and old valet Victor. You will be living at the Cecil Hotel until further notice. Call you there Mr. James Bennett from Manchester. I'll come visit you there tomorrow. Don't leave the hotel until I pick you up." Charlie Brand got ready, and Raffles left the villa with the old valet, having closed everything properly. At the Strand he said goodbye to Charlie and drove on alone. He stepped out in front of the well-known, distinguished restaurant of the Demi-Monde. In this room he hoped to find Miss Tony. Count Albergo had mentioned this place as his rendezvous with her. John Raffles passed through the lavishly decorated halls and saw in a quiet corner the lady with the thief's lantern, as he called her, sitting, apparently waiting for someone. Count Albergo was not yet present. With the boldness of a man of the world, Raffles sat down at her table and asked in an unabashed tone, "Shall we have supper together?" Replied the miss, "I am waiting for a friend." "To Count Albergo?" asked Raffles in a low tone, amused at the lady's astonished countenance. She looked at him nervously and asked, "How do you know that?" "I know everything, I'm a mind reader," joked the great unknown. "If thou wilt give me thy beautiful hands, I will divinate thee from the lines." "You are jesting, sir." "No, lady, not at all. I can reveal the past and the future to you." "Nonsense," replied Miss Tony, "that is impossible." "I bet," laughed Raffles. "Very well," said the lady, "bet a £10 note against supper with me. Can you tell me, where have I been this afternoon?" John Raffles took a £10 note from his wallet and put it on the table. "I take it," he said. "All right," laughed Miss Tony, holding out her hands to him. "Go ahead." Lord Lister held her hands and looked at them, apparently very attentively. Then he spoke softly. "You are with Dr. Bin Sabatini." Startled, Miss Tony looked at him and her hands which he held trembled. "How can you know that?" asked the beautiful criminal with trembling lips. "I told you I'm a mind reader," Raffles joked, "and now I'll tell you more. I know that 2 nights ago you were with a certain Mr. Morton, a jeweler. You had a thief's lantern with you, and were stealing the shop. Moreover, we already know each other from New York. Your name is not Tony, but but Marietta, and you are wanted in New York for murder. Perhaps you remember the body hidden in a barrel, and the blonde Austrian, Pietro is dead. It would please him to meet you at last, though the black Marietta has turned into a blonde Tony." With eyes full of horror the unmasked stared at the gentleman opposite her, her breath caught, and the hall seemed to revolve with her. She wanted to pull her hands out of his, but in vain. They were held in as if by screws, and suddenly Raffles took from his pocket a pair of handcuffs, which he put on the lady in the twinkling of an eye. "Sturdy bracelets," he said mockingly to the half-conscious woman, "and now, without raising much attention, follow me to the desk of the restaurant." The great unknown told the chief of the institution that he had been forced to capture a dangerous criminal and that she was now to be locked up in the station until the detectives arrived. He then telephoned Scotland Yard and had himself connected with Detective Marhome. "Come at once to the Italian restaurant in Oxford Street to pick up the Camorrist locked up in the office there." "Have I the honor to speak to Raffles?" asked Marhome. "Yes, my dear," he laughed, "I can see that we are good acquaintances. Don't forget to come right away." "Immediately," promised Marhome. The great unknown went back into the hall to wait for Count Albergo. He was already looking around the tables. Raffles called a waiter, tipped him well, and said, "Inform the gentleman who is passing the tables there that the lady he is looking for, Miss Tony, has gone to Dr. Sabatini is gone. He is requested to take her there. But don't say I gave you this message." The waiter, accustomed to such things in this demi-monde restaurant, smiled modestly and rushed to Count Albergo. The great unknown saw that he first shook his head incredulously, and then left the hall. Raffles immediately followed him, wanting to know where Dr. Sabatini's house was, and in a hired carriage he followed the Count's equipage. Without suspecting that he was followed, the Earl had left the carriage near the house of the bloodthirsty. The last bit he went on foot. Raffles stalked the Italian like a shadow down the dark street, and a triumphant smile crossed his face as he walked the Earl up the steps of Dr. Sabatini climb. Immediately after Albergo entered, Raffles rushed to read the nameplate. "I succeeded," he whispered, and as unnoticed as he had come he disappeared again. Meanwhile Detective Marhome and one of his colleagues had picked up Miss Tony and transported them to Scotland Yard. She was locked up in a very secure cell. Chapter 7. At Dr. Sabatini. The bloodthirsty was dumbfounded when Count Albergo entered and inquired about Miss Tony. "You are insane," he replied. "Miss Tony is not here. Hasten back to the restaurant and try to find out, by means of a generous tip from the waiter, who gave him the message. Bring me the answer." When Count Albergo left the house, he did not see that a dark figure standing in a deep portico watched him until he was out of sight. Shortly afterwards Raffles left the porch. He took a car in one of the nearby streets and had himself taken to Dr. Sabatini's home. He left the car waiting in front of the house and called. When it was opened, he said, "I am the magistrate Tyler, and come on the recommendation of Count Albergo, whom I just spoke to. I'm looking for a doctor for my critically ill wife. Tell the doctor I'll be waiting for him with a car." Some time passed before the woman came to tell him that Dr. Sabatini was too tired to go out. "Go back," said Raffles, "and tell him that Count Albergo is a good friend of mine and recommends me to the doctor." He gave the grumbling old man a coin, and he went back to the doctor. Just 2 minutes later she reported. "He comes." Raffles was waiting by the car. "Dr. Sabatini?" he asked in a very polite tone, taking off his hat. The bloodthirsty looked sharply at Raffles, but in the uncertain light of the street lamps he could not make out accurately. "Is your wife sick?" he asked as he got in. "Yes, doctor," replied Raffles, following him. "She has a high fever, is delirious, and I am very much afraid for her life." The car was traveling at full speed. The driver had been given a large tip, and the address Raffles had given him as the final destination of the trip was the villa in Regent Park. "Do you know Count Albergo?" asked Dr. Sabatini. "You came to me at his recommendation, didn't you?" "Yes," replied Raffles, "I know him very well, and hope to repay him for this great service. He called me you as very capable." Raffles saw that Dr. Sabatini cast suspicious looks through the window. "It is a long road we travel. Aren't we here in Regent Park?" the doctor asked when finally the car stopped in front of Raffles' house. "No," replied the other, Here is Windsor Park. I do not know that name, replied Dr. Sabatini, but I seldom leave my house. They left the car together and Raffles opened the iron gate. Dr. Sabatini stood suspiciously. The building is completely dark, he said. Our rooms are on the other side, Raffles assured him, opening the door. He immediately turned on the electric lights. May I ask you to follow me down these stairs? Asked Raffles. A few moments later the bloodthirsty stood in Raffles's study, and he offered him an armchair by the fire. You must excuse me for a moment, he said to Dr. Sabatini, I will inform my wife of your arrival. Raffles left the room and Dr. Sabatini looked in amazement at a beautiful grandfather clock. Where had he seen that clock again? Suddenly a terrible thought seized him. Wouldn't this clock have been featured in all the newspapers as a masterpiece by Raffles months ago? The cold sweat of fear came to his forehead. Was he here in the master thief's house? Was he held captive here? In vain he tried to reassure himself with the convincing thought that Raffles was dead after all. There the door of the room was opened. Startled, the bloodthirsty turned his head in that direction, and, as though petrified, with wide-open mouth and bulging eyes, he gazed at the elegant, slender figure of Raffles. He approached with a mocking smile. He held a revolver in his right hand, in the left a pair of steel shackles, such as the ones used by Scotland Yard. Dr. Sabatini wanted to scream, but fear and dread closed his throat. He couldn't make any sound. It is my pleasure to see you with me so soon after my death, said Raffles, and I take the liberty of offering you a present. Give me your hands and take it, Dr. Sabatini. Don't make any other move, my Browning pistol has the quirk of hitting even a nail-head. Dr. Sabatini did not dare to resist. Raffles cuffed his trembling hands and slammed the steel locks shut with a bang. Raffles then sat down opposite the doctor and lit a cigarette. The explosion was very successful, he began in a pleasant conversational tone. It could be heard 2 miles away, and no one suspected that so much noise was made just because of me. But I see your feet tremble as if you had a fever. I have a good medicine for that. Look here. He took a second pair of shackles from his pocket and put them on the frightened Dr. Sabatini too, so that he was now shackled hand and foot in his chair. What will you do with me? He spoke in a hoarse voice. What one does to a mad dog or to a ravenous tiger, replied Raffles, and now allow me to introduce your doppelganger to you. He disappeared into his dressing room and transformed himself, using wax, paint, a grey beard and wig, into a striking likeness of Dr. Sabatini. He thought he saw a ghost when Raffles returned to the study. The great unknown laughed and, as he called Dr. Sabatini's overcoat and hat, he said, You see, that is art. An art of which I am a supporter. Your business, doctor, the razor and the cutting of the neck is a miserable and mean job. And now I will inspect your pockets. Let me go, pleaded Dr. Sabatini, I offer you a princely fortune. I already have that, laughed Raffles, taking his safe key from one of the doctor's pockets. I will offer your victims money to all kinds of charities. And now, goodbye. I'll order a cell for you at Old Bailey Prison. Sleep well. Mercy, groaned the chief of the murderers. Raffles left without answering. Downstairs in the vestibule he turned off the electric light, closed the front door behind him and took a seat in the car. Back, he ordered, and the car disappeared at breakneck speed. Sir has been away a long time, said the old caretaker to him. Count Albergo is waiting upstairs in the ante-room. Lord Lister, imitating exactly the usual manner of the bloodthirsty, muttered a few unintelligible words into his grey beard and went upstairs. While waiting for the doctor, he had carefully observed the position of his rooms. The dimly lit windows had betrayed him. Now he had to get rid of Count Albergo. When the latter saw the alleged Dr. Sabatini enter, he exclaimed, Master, Miss Tony has been captured. I know, replied Raffles. What should I do? The comrades await your orders in the restaurant Umberto in East End. I have a key here, said Raffles, drawing out his own house key, that fits Raffles' house, Regent Park. Tomorrow morning, take a wagon, a box furniture wagon, and make sure that several of us dress up as wallpaperers. Into that car the safe and all the valuables of that sniffer dog must be loaded. However, bring everything here. We want to take possession of that man's inheritance. Make sure to be there by 10 o'clock. I will also come. We can work undisturbed, No one lives in the house. And now let me rest, I am weary. Count Albergo bowed submissively and kissed Raffles' hand, on which glittered the precious diamond which he had taken from the doctor. As soon as the Earl was gone, Raffles entered the study of Dr. Sabatini, where he started his work. In the safe, which he first opened, he discovered a fortune of almost £2 million sterling in all kinds of papers of value. He filled a large briefcase which he saw standing there with the money, and then began to search the writing table. There he immediately found a neatly kept register listing the victims who had been murdered by the Black Hand on the orders of the bloodthirsty. But, what was of much greater value, the list of the members of the Black Hand. That was what he was looking for. Now he made his way to the vestibule, where the caretaker seemed to be waiting for his orders. He called to her in Italian. "Get a carriage right away." "A carriage? Now, in the night?" the old woman asked in surprise. "Soon," Raffles ordered, and he waited until she left the house. It took half an hour before a carriage stopped in front of the house. Raffles had the coachman come into the house, and he was to carry the so valuable trunk from the study to the carriage. Then followed Raffles, who said to the housekeeper, "No one should know that I am going on a journey. I'll be back tomorrow night." The old man kissed his hands and closed the door behind him. Raffles called to the coachman, "Hotel Cecil," and he rode away with the millions of the Camorra. Charlie Brand was astonished when he was awakened at 3 a.m. and Raffles entered his room. 2 servants followed with the trunk. "There I am, my boy," laughed Lister, after the servants had gone, "and I bring the war chest of the Camorra with me. It's worth it, though. Now I want to smoke a cigarette and drink a cup of tea at night. Thereupon I shall make telephone calls to Scotland Yard, and give our friend Baxter a glorious work. He can do tomorrow what no police officer has yet succeeded in, defusing the Black Hand." Detective Marholm was on the phone when Raffles called Scotland Yard. He recognized the voice and said, "Hello, Lord Lister, is there anything else to do today? It's already quite late." "The best time for our profession," Raffles joked over the phone. "The citizens are asleep and only the thieves and detectives are awake. I have a lot of work for you. You may receive the chief of the Black Hand in handcuffs at 10 o'clock tomorrow at my old house, and half a dozen of his fellow murderers in addition. They come, disguised as wallpaperers, to plunder my house." "All right," replied Detective Marholm, "I'll make sure everything is all right." And in silence Marholm wished to be Raffles. The next day the paperboys loudly shouted the sensational report concerning Raffles' last masterpiece against the Camorra or Black Hand. Dr. Sabatini and many of his accomplices ended their lives on the gallows. Before hanging on the gallows, the bloodthirsty received a newspaper from an unknown sender. It contained the following message in bold letters: "Raffles donates £2 million to the orphanages of London. A royal gift." "At my expense," muttered Dr. Sabatini, cursed. The next part will contain Among the Ruins of Messina. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.